Good afternoon. My name is Jeffrey Lemont. I'm a director of director in LPC Cresa and also an equity shareholder of the company. The paper today is on what commercial tenants want. Now, this paper was written pre-COVID-19, so this paper was written some 6 to 8 weeks or so ago, and we can certainly take a view as to what we thought that commercial tenants may want at that point in time. That may change by the time we come out of post COVID-19 because circumstances may change, but I will be addressing some of those items as we move through the paper. So what I'd like to be able to cover in this paper is 5 main areas, 5 main topics. So what do commercial tenants want? First of all, starting with a selection of obvious items that most tenants think about when they're considering their office accommodation requirements, whether they consider staying, whether they consider to stay or go or expand or contract, as the case may be. Also looking at a selection of less obvious items. Now, most of these sort of items I'll be coming to a little later are not the sort of things that most organisations think about, but we put these ideas to them and try and ascertain as to how important or otherwise they are. Also like to cover what does the future hold, including technology. Now, we're not mind readers, we can't predict the future, but we can at least talk about what the future may hold and how that may impact on the premises affecting the occupier company. Also like to cover, what is the relationship important? Is the relationship important between the landlord, the tenant, and the tenant rep? And if so, why? And what are landlords doing, or what are some landlords doing to attract and retain tenants? So they're the main topics. So let's start to dive into it. What do tenants want? Some of the obvious items. Let's start with what they call Rule 101, protecting the business. And that's really what Rule 101 is all about, which is protecting the business and making sure that the business is not subjected to undue risk. The primary concern of most CEOs is obviously, apart from making money and making sure the business works well, is making sure the business is protected well, trying to make sure it's not going to be lead into traps. So the first thing they want to do is protect the business. That comes back to a range of things with accommodation. Does the organisation want to stay? Does it want to go? Does it want to expand? Does it want to contract? Whatever they need to do, they should be making an informed decision to make sure the business is protected. So let's go through what some of these obvious items are. The first obvious item that an organisation might consider is the type of grade of building that they're actually looking at. Do they want to be in a premium grade building, an A grade building, a B grade building? Do they want to be in the high rise of the building, the low rise of the building, mid-rise, the case may be? Most organisations have a basic idea as to what type of accommodation they want, which has it has a bearing basically on the image they want to present to their client base. And also, what I have here on the left-hand side, generally it's about attracting and retaining good people, good talent and so on. So that comes back to a range of issues with their accommodation. Some organisations look very closely at ESD, environmental sustainable development. To some organisations is less important, but we haven't met an organisation yet, a client yet, that doesn't want to have a cleaner, brighter, safer Australia for them and their children and grandchildren to follow, and of course for their staff. Most organisations will also think about location and transport. These again are obvious items. Do they want to be near rail, bus, ferry, or all three, or some other means of transport? But they should provide accommodation, which is providing accommodation links for their staff so they can arrive to work safely and depart safely back home. The working environment is very important, but I will be coming back and talking about that a little bit more detail as to what actually constitutes the type of working environment. Commercial terms are obviously very important. I'll be going through on a further slide and talking about what actually constitutes commercial terms, such as rent, cost of occupancy, and so on. Some organisations want to know about the end of trip facilities, so that they've got the benefit for their staff to be in this building, such as are there bicycle facilities, storage facilities? Is there a gym downstairs? Are there showers? Are there change rooms, lockers, and so on? Many organisations also want a certain amount of flexibility, and I'll be coming back to this in terms of less obvious items, but a certain amount of flexibility that as their requirements grow, or as they shrink for that matter, they want a certain amount of flexibility within the lease. So they want the lease to be able to cater for the requirements of the business as it ebbs and flows accordingly. What are some of the other items? Some organisations require certain rights, such as signage rights, storage rights, communication rights on the roof, parking rights. In fact, if anything, probably parking within certain major capital cities at the moment, especially where there's a charge on top of the car parking for a parking levy, has become less popular over the years, particularly, for example, in Sydney. Most organisations talk in terms of their cost of occupancy, not just their cost of rent, the total cost of what it is to actually physically occupy those premises, which usually takes into consideration such factors as rent, outgoings, exit costs, entry costs, the amortisation of their fit out. So there's a selection of obvious items. Let's talk about what type of fit outs there are around. There's various types of fit out that you'll find in office premises around the country today. There are a whole lot of buzzwords out there, words such as agile, smart, collaborative, ABW, which is activity-based working. Those words generally mean a very similar outcome, which is basically a smart, agile type environment, which is supported by a high level of technology. Some organisations work in hubs where they may have a hub. For example, they may have a central fit out. They may have a central office, say in Sydney or Melbourne or Brisbane, as the case may be. Then they may have a hub elsewhere, a hub where their staff can come to in a less CBD area if they have staff living in those sorts of areas. Co-working has become quite popular over the last couple of years, where organisations um, can come together and work in a very close sort of environment. In fact, WeWork have actually termed that almost what's the word I'm looking for? Have almost put let's use the word a mandate on that word for co-working, where you have a lot of organisations working within a lot of people working within the same premises, a co-working type environment. Some organisations still want to work on a traditional open plan type environment where they may have a combination of offices, fit out, and so on. Becoming less popular, but some organisations, particularly if they require a high level of security and so on, will still have offices, meeting rooms, breakout areas, and so on. And on the subject of meeting rooms and breakout areas, this area up here, agile, smart, collaborative, activity-based working, as I said, supported by a high level of technology, in a very smart environment, but they also have these sort of areas where you can actually break out. There's potentially more people that can fit into the space, but they return space back to their team members and their staff by having breakout areas, meeting rooms, and so on. So there's a selection of some of the types of fit out. We'll talk about later in this presentation as what could be next. Let's talk about some of the working environment. Most organisations will consider the type and configuration of the floor plate. It's generally easier to configure a floor plate that is either square-ish or rectangular in shape, rather than a building that's perhaps round or oblong or with all sorts of nooks and crannies in it. But having said that, the less regular shape it is can also present some challenges, some interesting challenges to the designers that can come up with some creative ideas on how to use the space. But generally, the floor plate, if it's a squarish type floor or rectangular type floor plate, on most occasions can be easier to fit out than a less regular shape. Some organisations look, for example, at views. Are views important? To some, the answer is yes. To some, the answer to the question is no. Generally speaking, views come with a price tag attached to it. Is it a harbour view? Is it a river view? Is it an open plan view of some sort? And again, generally speaking, the higher that the occupier is in the building, generally you'll find there's an escalation between the top of the building and the bottom of the building in rent. Most organisations want to be able to ensure that they have an abundance of natural light in the premises, and that will also generally affect the way they fit the premises out, and if they are going to have enclosed offices, as to where they will be. If there are enclosed offices, in the majority of occasions, they're usually on the inside around the core area, leaving the workstation environment, having the bulk of the natural light that they can then penetrate the rest of the floor plate. The working environment, I've talked before about signage. Signage can be important to some and can be less important to others. Some organisations are also concerned that it may present a security risk if they have their name on the building. So some of them some can be reluctant to have signage. In fact, there are some organisations that will specifically require a prohibition on signage because they only want the building to be known by a certain street address, as 99 Example Street, as the case may be. Most within their working environment will also consider that they want to be able to have the ability to be able to have the flexibility within their working structure to be able to adapt rather than doing wholesale changes every time they want to make changes to their existing fit out. Depending upon the amount of space involved, an organisation will then look for do they want to be over a single level or do they want to be over contiguous space? Now, if there's going to be multiple floors involved, most organisations will generally require the space to be contiguous, contiguous levels. There have been examples that we have seen where an organisation can have their operations split if they want to be in the same building and put their less expensive operations or the less income producing operations into lower floors and have the more income producing areas of the business in the upper levels. So if we return to the commercial terms, so here are a selection of some of the commercial terms that organisations would consider, or if we were involved, we would certainly have these in front of mind. Rental, the most obvious one is rental. What is the rental that is going to be paid over the period of the lease, which comes back to the rental and the rent structure. Are there going to be fixed rental reviews throughout the lease, or are there going to be a combination of fixed rental reviews and CPI increases? Or will there be a market rent review or more within the lease, and whether or not those market rent reviews would be capped or collared? In other words, they could rise to a certain figure or fall to a certain figure. So it's something that we would look at. Most organisations at the end of the day, they don't want any surprises. They want to know at the end of the day how much their cost of occupancy is going to be within the development. So they want to be able to remove as less surprises as they can, and having a predetermined rental structure or a rental structure that has caps on it, so it can't rise above a certain figure or fall below a certain figure, is important. Obviously, most organisations will consider the term of the lease. In Australia, a typical lease term for in a better grade building, a premium grade building, or an A grade building, B grade building, typically seems to be around about 8 years. And the reason being that appears to be the most convenient time for organisations to amortise their cost of entry, exit, fit out over a period of typically around 8 years. There are some organisations, particularly US-based firms, that are very uncomfortable with 8-year terms and normally want a term less than 8 years or 10 years. In fact, many of them look for terms in the order of around 5 years, particularly if they're a US-based company. A typical commercial organisation will also look for options for renewal. If they're entering into an initial lease term, whether it be 8 years or 5 years or 6 years, as the case may be, how many options that they can get beyond that, so that they can renew the lease on the same terms and same conditions, what they may need to agree upon at the start of each option period as to what the rent will be. The commercial terms could also take into consideration the cost of car parking within the building, and that would need to be added to their cost of occupancy. Now, depending upon where this commercial building is, there could be an incentive involved provided by the landlord. Most deals in the better grade buildings around Australia are generally conducted on a face value rental basis, whereby the rental has been inflated to some extent by the provision of a leasing incentive. Now, depending upon market conditions, that leasing incentive will be available by negotiation as to what the percentage of the lease term it could be, whether it be 5%, 20%, 30% as the case may be, which could be influenced by a whole series of factors, including economic conditions at the time, supply and demand factors in the city as the case may be, and also the respective negotiating strengths of the parties concerned. Most incentives within Australia are usually taken in the form of a contribution to fit out, or possibly a rental discount, or even a cocktail involving a rent-free period from the lease commencement date. Incentives need to be put into a tax-effective structure, so the occupier company may need to get advice from their accountants. There are some deals within around Australia that are conducted on an effective rental basis where there's no incentive involved. But the greater bulk of deals, to our experience, are normally on a face value rent where that rental has been inflated by the provision of incentive. There are some organisations that simply don't want an incentive because they have sufficient funding to be able to provide their own fit out. They certainly represent the minority of deals carried out. Notwithstanding, we would like all tenants to be able to be offered the choice of either doing a face value deal or an effective rental deal. So as I say, a face value deal is whereby the rental has been inflated by the value of an incentive. An effective rental deal is the underlying rental value of the deal where it's not been inflated by the provision of a leasing incentive. Hence these two here: face value deal, effective deal. Most landlords will certainly try and build into their deal a provision to make good the premises by the tenant at the expiry date of the lease. Naturally, in our organisation, LPC Australia, representing tenants, we try wherever we can to remove the obligation to make good the premises at lease expiry. That will depend upon, again, a number of conditions, the negotiating strengths of the parties concerned, and particularly in terms of the amount of office space that is leased at the time. Some of the other things that organisations consider when they're relocating to another premises, or for that matter, even staying, considering restructuring their lease based on new terms and conditions. Most organisations want to know where their competitors are. Most of them will know that before we start producing a heat map of some sort showing where their competitors are located. So clearly many organisations, or most organisations, will want to know where their competitors are. In fact, some organisations would be extremely reluctant to even occupy a building if their competitors are located within that building. So on occasions, depending upon the size of the transaction, it may be possible to introduce a prohibition on having their competitors within that building. Possibly it may be limited to a number of competitors. Proximity to clients is another very important factor, and the reason being that most organisations will look to what will be convenient premises for their clients to be able to gain access to, and for that matter, for the organisation to be able to go and see their clients. So again, one of the important bearings on where the proximity to their clients, unless of course they're an online business, then I guess it within reason doesn't really matter where they are. But most organisations will at least have some regard to proximity of their clients. I talked before about end of trip facilities. I've already covered that one. Some it's more important than others, but again, most organisations want to know if their staff want to exercise, giving them a healthy mind and body. Are there end of trip facilities in the building? Some organisations want storage. I mentioned before about other types of rights, such as storage rights, license rights for communications, such as microwave, satellite, signage rights, and so on. Some organisations, it's extremely important to have backup power facilities. Backup power so if in the event that the building should go offline, that the building has sufficient power to run not only the essential service of the building, such as lifting, lighting, air conditioning, but can also run a certain amount of tenant power as well. Many tenants want to know about, do they have an uninterrupted supply of condenser water to run their high-tech areas for their computer facilities and so on. So some buildings will have more than others. Usually that's measured in litres per second. Here's a selection of some of the less obvious items. I started this presentation off by saying previously that this presentation was written before COVID-19, and as a result of it, when we come out of this, that organisations are going to look probably very differently at their office space compared to what they did at the time this paper was written. And the reason being that many professional service companies are not occupying their office space and are now having many of their staff working from home, if that's at all possible. But here's a selection of some of the sorts of items, predominantly pre-COVID-19. But some of these we've now written in as to what might be the situation going forward. But some of the less obvious items. Expansion and contraction rights. So we, as tenant advisors, will try and get a handle on what our clients' plans are for the future, how the business might expand. Are they in growth mode? Are they in acquisition mode? So if that was the case, we'd want to be able to build in rights that as their business grows, or should it contract, they have the right for the business to be able to, the premises to be able to ebb and flow in line with the business. So really the premises need to be able to match the requirements of the business. So expansion and contraction rights. If those rights are introduced, there needs to be specific wording on how they will actually work within the lease. What is the principle of how they'll expand or how they'll contract, and how will it actually operate? What will the rent be? Will there be an incentive? What will the reviews be? How much notice they give? What sort of condition will the premises have to be left in? What sort of condition will the premises have to be acquired in if they were to expand? And conversely, what are the requirements should the tenant actually contract during the term of the lease? So it's flexibility within the lease structure. And I suspect this will have probably a big bearing when we come out of COVID-19 as the types of clauses that you might start seeing written into lease agreements. There may be force majeure clauses whereby there are circumstances beyond the control of either party that might give rise to possibly a termination of the lease or a partial termination of the lease. There might be clauses that come into existence to do with frustration, that if the premises can't be occupied, does the tenant or the landlord, for that matter, if they're suffering frustration, have the right to terminate the lease? This might come under the whole category of why there could be termination rights. In any event, early termination rights. So in any event, some organisations will want a break clause, a right to be able to terminate the lease during the lease for various reasons. If they're entering into an 8-year lease, they may want to break the lease at the end of year 5 or the end of year 6, if for certain reasons they believe it is appropriate. We will talk to clients about the need for a building services regime. Now, a building services regime is basically a form of regime that requires the services to work. So if the services of the building can't work, I mean, at the end of the day, the tenant is paying a certain rental, expecting there will be lifting, lighting, air conditioning that will work. Now, on occasions, there will be services that don't work, which may be beyond the scope of the landlord. They can't help it. If there's an excavator in the street that digs up a cable that stops the power going to the building, unless of course they cause that to happen. So most tenants will want to have some sort of relief within the building in their lease structure if the services fail for a certain period of time, such as the lifting, such as the lighting. So we will try and introduce some sort of regime within the lease structure that would permit the tenant to be able to seek an adjustment to the rent during that period. Which comes to the next point about a building policy statement. Now, a building policy statement is basically a statement along the lines that the landlord will maintain the building to a certain pre-agreed standard, such as an agreed standard to maintain it to an A grade building or a premium grade building or a B grade building. It's reasonable to say, because unless the building and its services has ongoing capital applied to it throughout the term of the lease, it is reasonable to think that every building will drop a grade or 2 or 3 unless it can be maintained during that lifetime as a premium grade building or as an A grade building, as the case may be. I've talked before about make good. We certainly, wherever we can as tenant advisors, seek to remove that obligation that the premises need to be made good at the end of the lease. If that clause cannot be removed from the lease, that the tenant is responsible for a make good provision, then one needs to consider the time it's going to take to do that. So if you're talking about, say, a 6-year lease or an 8-year lease, as the case may be, it may end up being 3 months less than that, because depending upon the size of the premises, it may take possibly 2 months, 3 months, 1 month, as the case may be, to physically make good the premises back to the condition that existed at the lease commencement date. So that's something that needs to be factored into the equation if that obligation cannot be removed. I think I've covered previously about signage rights, storage rights, other types of rights that may exist. I mean, some organisations require satellite communication, microwave communication. Whatever goes into whatever they needs a form of license to cover it if it's outside the main body of the lease. I talked before about tenants and competitors. If that's an issue to the tenant, we would normally seek a requirement that there's a prohibition on certain types of tenants coming within the building, including their competitors. And there would need to be a list of items that would be, there would need to be a list of potential competitor organisations that would need to form part of that clause. The landlord relationship. It's extremely important for the landlord and the tenant to get on. So, we advocate as tenant advisors. We're advocating that for a nice, healthy relationship between the landlord and the tenant. The last thing one wants is to be at each other's throat, because when the relationship, or if the relationship was to sour, and we've seen many of them that have, that's a pretty good reason why the tenant will be looking to move to alternate premises at the expiration of the lease. So what does the future hold? Well, we certainly haven't got a crystal ball, but there could be a whole lot of things out there. And as I said before, post-COVID-19, there's going to be a whole range of things that are going to crop up. Most leases today don't have a force majeure clause. They don't have a frustration clause, but I'm certainly sure that there'll be something in the future leases, if there's anything like what we're going through at the moment, a pandemic. If the tenant can't occupy their premises, I'm sure there'll be all sorts of regimes in there that may give the opportunity for the tenant, possibly the landlord, to terminate the lease. So leaving COVID-19 aside, where will the future take us? Well, wherever it's going to take us is probably going to be largely driven through the use of technology. And technology will play a huge part in how we play our lives going forward. Will remote working be a possibility in the future? Well, it may be. I'm not a great fan of remote working. I do believe that you can work from home 1 day a week or 2 days a week, as the case may be. But I've always taken the view that with a professional service organisation, it's very hard to obtain the best out of your people unless you're working within a group and you've got all those collective minds going and juices going for the benefit of the organisation. So look, there's a place for remote working, but I doubt whether we'll all be working from home for 5 days a week in the future. Maybe 1 day a week, we'll see. What is becoming popular is this concept of third-party spaces, where an organisation may take less space than what they think they need within the building, where there are third-party spaces. So some buildings will provide the opportunity that if you want to ebb or flow, you can actually do it on a short-term basis within the building. So rather than having a whole series of meeting rooms within your own premises, or boardrooms as the case may be, you may utilize third-party spaces elsewhere in the building provided by the landlord, and only use them once a month or once a quarter as the case may be, or if you have an excess amount of work, you're using them every day of the week. But that's something that I think will grow in popularity. What may also occur is that some space could be taken on a flexible space, on a fixed basis. So if an organisation, just to simplify it, has a requirement for 10,000 metres, it possibly may occur, and we've seen some of the examples of this over the years, where an organisation says, I will commit to 5,000 square metres on certain pre-agreed terms and conditions, and I want the other 5,000 square metres to be totally flexible. And that flexibility, it can ebb and flow. They can grow or they can contract, as the case may be. That may or may not become popular in time going by. Will an organisation have one central headquarters in a CBD requirement or a suburban requirement, or will they have multiple? There's mixed views on that as to whether or not the organisation should be under the one roof, or Should they have, or should they have a number of disparate offices that may suit them depending upon whether some of their operations are lower cost and can be placed elsewhere. But then they have the issue about how they harness the talents of all those people if they are if they are not in a central location. So will working from home be important? It's almost very similar to this whole concept of remote working. I do believe you can work from home through technology, but I just don't believe it's highly likely that in the years to come, that there will be all of us working from home. I think we can all work from home for a period of, many of us can work from home for a period of time, but certainly I think it's very difficult to harness the talents of everybody if everybody is not there on a regular basis. So what type of fit outs will we have going forward? Is it going to be smart? Is it going to be activity-based working? Is it going to be traditional? Time will tell. Certainly with this current basis of social distancing, the concept of having very close togetherness hasn't been popular over the last 6 to 8 weeks. Time will tell. Whatever it is, we believe it'll probably be supported by a higher level of technology in the way an organisation works. Some organisations like the idea of working in hubs, especially where they feel that they can have a group of people working outside the main central headquarters. They may have, for example, if it's in Sydney, where I live, they may have an operation in Baulkham Hills, or they may have one in the Sutherland Shire, or they may have one in the Inner West, where their employees can go to a hub and work within a hub. But again, that depends upon the line of business that organisation's in, rather than coming into one central head office. So I believe there's a place for it, but it depends upon the line of business that the organisation is in. So is the relationship important with the landlord? So are all so I guess really what I'm doing here is proposing some questions. I'm not going to attempt to answer them other than saying, are all landlords the same? I can possibly answer some of these. The answer clearly is no, not all landlords the same. Um, some landlords take a different view with how they engage with their tenant, their client, their customer, as opposed to some others. So I think it's certainly very important that most tenant organisations want to know they have a very good relationship with their landlord. So what do landlords do well? I think some landlords today are trying to find ways to create some sort of point of difference over their competitive landlord by the services that they can provide within the building over and above the standard you would expect of naturally having the air conditioning work, the lifting, the lighting, the cleaning, and so on. Some landlords are now providing all sorts of services through the reception, such as dry cleaning services, even tickets to games and so on. I'm not going to attempt to answer this one here, but what can landlords do better? I'm sure there are some things out there that are quite creative that many landlords will be doing over a period of time to try and get a better relationship with their tenant. What are some of the other landlords doing? Again, these two are very closely linked. What are they doing to attract and retain tenants? Certainly, certainly the landlords that can offer the need for flexibility, generally we've found sits extremely well with most organisations that are in expansion and contraction mode. So as we contend, it's for a landlord, not that we advocate for them, because we're here pushing the barrow on behalf of the occupier organisation. So we represent the tenant. But from a landlord, how can a landlord create a point of difference that the organisation thinks twice before they actually pack their bags and move? I had a very interesting conversation with a landlord some time ago that said that when one of their tenants in one of their office buildings move, they don't blame the tenant, they blame themselves. They blame themselves and say, well, if the tenant's going to move, why haven't we been able to solve that problem? Why haven't we been able to move them into one of their own buildings elsewhere? Were they not close enough to the organisation to find out what was going on? So it's a nice place to come from, quite refreshing. Some organisations, some landlord organisations insist upon doing inspections and inspection and presentation with the client at the time they're physically looking at the property. They want to be able to see the whites of their eyes and see if they're genuine and see whether it'd actually be a good marriage, a good partnership to have them in their building. I can think of one particular landlord that used to talk about, and they used to try and pass the message down to their to all their team, their staff. Love the tenant like your brother. So that'll remain to be seen whether or not that sort of those words sort of stick. But the concept is love you. You know, the concept being create a relationship with your tenant, have them there for the long term. What do you need to hold them in the building? What do you need to do that if they want to be able to move premises, that the first port of call is going to be with another building owned by that particular landlord. So we're pretty well coming to the end of our presentation now. So I guess with the things that I've mentioned earlier, does this present a challenge? Does it present a challenge in terms of what's going to happen as the future goes on, or does it present what we would like to consider a window of opportunity? So now my name again is Jeffrey Dearmonth. I'm a director and shareholder in LBC Cresa, and LBC Cresa is an organisation that represents and advises the occupier, the tenant, the occupier premises around Australia. We have various offices in Australia and New Zealand, and we are part of a global firm headquartered in the USA. Thank you for the opportunity of doing this presentation. I hope this has been of assistance to you.